Okay, well, I guess that I'm starting this off. This is the memory panel for those of you who are joining us. And I right now don't have any visibility into that. Oh, 11 participants. So I'm sorry about the banter that you guys have had to put up with. I'm Jim Handy, and I'm the panel moderator for this panel. We've got three memory experts who are joining us today that I'll be allowing to introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, I just wanted to briefly talk about what this panel is about, is that I've gathered together these experts to talk about memory in computing systems. The memory interfaces that we have right now have evolved, through history. And so because of that, they've got an awful lot of background. They do things kind of the way that they used to be done. And because they've evolved from older architectures, they consume more power than is ideal, and they don't deliver enough capacity and bandwidth. There are other constraints too that we'll go into with that. Another thing that's a very important deal is that memory in today's systems needs to be shared, and the current interfaces don't lend themselves to that. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this panel. It's going to be a very informal kind of a panel. It doesn't have any slides or anything, just discussions with questions. And so why don't I start with the introductions? Oh, first of all, I should introduce myself. I'm actually an industry analyst following the memory technologies. I write a blog called The Memory Guy, another one called The SSD Guy, and I work for a company, Objective Analysis, which does semiconductor market research. So with that, I'm going to ask Brian Allison to just tell us briefly about himself and then move on through the other presenters or the other panelists.
Yeah, my name is Brian Allison. I work for IBM. I've been here close to 30 years now. I'm an ASIC designer by trade. Been working a lot in kind of the open ecosystems as of late, kind of more in the accelerator kind of area. Got experience with a number of different, let's call it memory architectures, going back from x86 into power, all those different types of areas. So I don't know if I'm necessarily an expert, but I do have strong opinions.
Well, that's what's important.
Right. So that's kind of my background.
Yeah. Okay, fine then. And then Tanj, you've got a view on memory too. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tanj Bennett, and I worked at Microsoft for many years, and I was architect of Bing for a while. And from that and the interest in servers, I ended up as architect for a few generations of servers in Azure. During my time there, it became terribly obvious that memory was stuck. About 2015, by about that point, the scaling really had ended because the cylindrical capacitors they have were blocked by materials scaling rather than by lithography scaling. They've made very slow progress since then, and during that time, their fraction of system cost just exploded. They're now the most expensive part of a system. They're not improving in performance. They're barely improving in density. And so I became very interested in what can be done to get around that. And I think we'll talk about it a bit more, but my main view is that DDR has become a sticking point because it prevents competition, it prevents innovation. It's a literal state machine for DRAM, transferring the state machine into the CPU, which is great for DRAM, but it makes it almost impossible to introduce any alternative technology that could compete with DRAM, and we desperately need innovation in the memory space.
And you said that it was the most important part of the processor system, but you didn't say anything about power. It also is kind of a power hog in there, isn't it?
It can be. The DRAM itself is not that much of a power hog, as you can see if you look at the power numbers for HBM. There's something like 2 picojoules per bit on the memory access itself, but a lot more comes from the memory interface. There's as much as 40 picojoules per bit on DDR5, for example, if you just divide the power for a large DIMM by the bandwidth you get out of it.
I bet people in the audience haven't looked at it that way either. So
right, and yes, especially when I was working in Azure, system power is a grave concern, and the CPUs are, especially on the TSMC process, are continually getting more and more efficient. They're moving more and more bits for less power, but the DRAM on the other side, or the interface to the DRAM, shall I say, is not playing the game the way everything else should.
So we've got two very different backgrounds here. We've got somebody who looks at huge systems. We've got somebody who's an ASIC designer. And then for a third very different person, we've got Tom Coughlin. Tom, you wanted to introduce yourself?
Sure, Jim. Thank you. I'm Tom Coughlin. I'm the president of Coughlin Associates. I am also an industry analyst, and I do consulting work. Jim and I actually have done some work together. We have a report on emerging memory technologies, not emerging non-volatile memories, which I think refer a bit to some of the things that Tanj was talking about there. So I look forward to our panel discussion.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks everybody. So why don't we jump in? What I'm going to do is I'll ask.
You forgot somebody, didn't you? Isn't Alan part of the panel as well?
No, he's not.
Oh, he's not. I thought he was. I thought he was going to be our fourth sparring partner. Okay.
Just three of us, but we've only got 45 minutes, and so I think we'll be able to keep things going for a while. So yeah, but thanks for noticing that, Brian. So what I'm planning to do is I'll ask a few questions about power, ask some questions about disaggregation because that's important to what's going on with memory systems today. And then we'll get to questions from the audience. So anybody from the audience any attendee who wants to ask questions, please just go down to the bottom of the screen, go into the chat area and type in your question anytime that you want to. So why don't I kick off with, getting back to what Tanj was saying is, what is the significance of energy per bit in memory movement? How does that impact what goes on with system power?
Let me briefly just set the stage by giving some comparable numbers. If you look at machine learning and the latest of the advanced processors, they are doing a complete multiply add operation in about 1 picojoule per word per operation, and that's typically a 16-bit operation these days with a 32-bit or 24-bit result. So when you look at memory moving from main memory at, say, on HBM, we're approaching 4 picojoules per bit from the upside, getting better. That's roughly what HBM3 is expected to be, and that's per bit. Multiply that by 16 and you're at 64. Obviously, to get the rates of computation we need in these special purpose processors, there's no way they can go directly to DRAM. Even when you move the operations into the DRAM, the local DRAM at maybe 1 to 1.5 picojoules per bit is still 20 picojoules for that 16-bit entity. It's not a solution. You have to go to SRAM. Now, when you go to a server, and really the server workloads exceed the SRAM that you can put on a chip. So you're doing a lot of memory traffic. The proportion of power that's going into the memory system is just going up and up. And you could probably eliminate a power plant in America if you could get the power on the interfaces to divide by half. So it's no longer a small game.
It's a big game. I agree. Because you got to look at memory as, I don't know, to me, it's multifaceted, right? Because like you were saying, Tanj, for specific, let's call it type processors, let's call it, the NVIDIAs of the world, right? HBM memory it's well suited for, right? It's just a well suited engine for something like that. If you're getting into, kind of something on the edge, right? Or IoT, not so much. Right, it doesn't. The power footprint doesn't work very well there. If you're looking at the data center, right, that's got a totally different kind of set of requirements. And then you kind of got to look at, what the capability is of not only just let's call it the external memories, and even like HBM is a little bit different there, but even the caching capabilities of what you need to do, and having large enough caches internal to whatever processing unit that you have is something that you got to consider as well. Because like you said, I mean, if you look at where the vast majority of the beachfront, right? So if you're looking at a piece of silicon where a lot of beachfront is, has to be used, it's on the memory footprint. And then if you look at just how much caching you have to have on the silicon, how much silicon area that you have to have for the caches. So all of the, so it really depends on what workload you're trying to target. But I mean, you have to have significant energy and resources to really figure out what your overall memory structure looks like, right? Because it probably is one of the most important, to me, like processors anymore are almost commodities, right? To be honest, right? I mean, look at what Intel is doing, look at AMD is doing, right? I mean, they've got it down to a fine skilled art, right? But it's become almost a commodity, right? But what's changing a lot now is how you attack these different workloads with different memory structures, because things have kind of changed there. And things they're improving, but they still need to continue to evolve because there's still a lot of, I don't know what you want to call it, still a lot of room for improvement.
So Brian, when you're working on an ASIC design, like how early do you start considering what you're going to do about memory? Are you going to use HBM?
Extremely early. Yeah, writing concept, right? Writing concept. And I'm even doing some of that stuff with some new stuff that I'm working on, because we're kind of trying to figure out, we're looking at something for 25, 26. It's like, okay, what's going to happen in 25 and 26? Should I be looking at like LPDDR5? Should I be looking at DDR5, right? And then, with all the other things that actually have to happen on the ASIC itself, the memory footprint is relatively large. The number of IOs it takes, the power consumption that it has. And so we've got all of those facets, right? We want to get as much density as we possibly can, but I've got an extreme power envelope that I got to fall into as well. Right?
And your job is always trade-offs, right? That
you have it's all trade-offs.
You have to look at like the beachfront, how much area on the die is going to be used by the memory interface, and then weigh that off against how much power it consumes, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And you've got an elephant in the room, which is if you look at what Apple's been doing with the M1 series recently, they have clearly spotted the gap here, and they're using LPDDR4 for the M1 and LPDDR5, which takes them to 6400. They're running at twice the speed of their competition in terms of memory interface at very low power. They're about probably in the range of 10 picojoules per bit, and that has given them fantastic results. Now, at the moment, you can't scale that up to server size because of the packaging limitations, but they've demonstrated the point. Fantastic performance if you take care of the memory interface. You can see how they've deliberately scaled each processor to stay, more and more bandwidth as they want to go with more and more cores at a very high ratio compared to what the tradition has been. And as a result, they're leaving everyone in the dust. Now, if you say, okay,
that's really current information too.
Yeah, it is current.
Yeah, and if you can't do that with server with LPDDR, then you look and say, well, okay, what happens if I try to reach that sort of ratio with DDR5? You can't. It's just too much beatfront, too much power. But you can if you look at OMI. If you had, say, an OMI controller which had LPDDR5 associated with each controller, now you're back down to a high bandwidth per chip and a low energy per bit. Looking forward, saying, what has Apple just taught us and how should we respond to that? DDR5 is not the response.
Well, the other thing too is when you start to look at this whole memory buffer type paradigm, and it's not new, right? Intel did it 20 years ago, right? It's not new, but what's changed is the reasoning for why you would do it, right? And again, it gets very expensive if you have to put 8 or 10 channels of DDR off of your processor, right? That's a significant challenge. Right. And then to actually have to spin your processor if you want to try and keep up with some of this stuff, it's diminishing returns.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the processor spins in a little bit too, because when I start talking about disaggregation, I'm sure Tanj will have an awful lot to say about the fact that processors are, you know, they're tied to a DDR technology. I always think that it would be kind of funny to talk about Intel's DDR3 series of processors and then their DDR4 series of processors. And, you know, it would be kind of humiliating to the processors to talk about them that way, just because it seems like, unfortunately, the processors right now are tied to that stuff.
You know, and also like when you, like with the server design though too, right? When you do these memory buffers, you've kind of moved your power footprint off of the processor, right? You've moved it onto the memory buffer, right? And then you're actually, your composability of your server actually changes, right? Because it's extremely difficult to wire all these DDR interfaces, right? You know, especially when you're running at these high data rates, and then you only get like 1 DIMM per channel when you get to certain data rates. It's significantly challenging to do all of these channels to work at all these data rates, and it's extremely expensive from a power perspective. But if you can disaggregate that, right, and move that power away, right, it gives you a little bit more flexibility on what your composable server design would look like.
You can also use cheaper silicon for the controllers typically.
That's right.
Have to be
Yeah, they don't need to be leading edge.
Right, so your leading edge is used for the things that need to be leading edge. They're on the CPU.
Right, exactly.
So
Right.
Why don't you need to use leading edge silicon for the processor? I don't follow that.
No, for the memory buffer, you don't. For the memory buffer.
Most of what's going on is interfaces, right? You're interfacing to the memory chips, and you're interfacing to the RMI bus with an RMI controller. And interface logic does not, interfaces are a mixture of analog and digital, and they are not scaling the same way as the pure digital parts are. So there's relatively little downside to using an older, cheaper process like 16, 14 nanometer would do just fine for those speeds and those purposes.
And that runs at lower energy too, doesn't it?
It can, if you, it depends. I mean, you do get lower energy under some circumstances going to 7 nanometer, but you can certainly choose a lower energy.
I think it gives you more flexibility. You can choose the node based on its, you know, the attributes that it has. It gives you a little bit more flexibility. You don't need to be in 5 nanometer all the way around the block just for that. Because you even see AMD doing it, even with some of their stuff, right? Their IO stuff, it's not in their cutting edge processor technology, right?
Well, that's that whole chiplet.
Partly why we have the power per bit, the energy per bit in the the DDR interfaces and the LPDDR for that, to some extent, is because these are technologies that can be implemented on the DRAM process. And the DRAM process simply isn't as good at driving an interface as the logic processes are. So a 16 nanometer or 14 nanometer logic process is very competitive in terms of more sophisticated IO compared with what's put on a DRAM chip.
Yeah, from a system standpoint, I would imagine most of the people, the attendees, are looking at this from a system standpoint, though. I mean, you know, it's they are not in a position to really make an awful lot of decisions, other than they might be able to influence their vendors as to what to produce, right?
I often wonder why the CPU vendors are so passive in this, given that they're giving, you know, more market to the DRAM vendors by not looking hard at this problem. You know, why do they want people like Azure or AWS or Google to spend more money on memory instead of more money on processors?
Yeah.
You know, the DRAM interface, the DDR interface is offloading DRAM onto the CPU. Why is that in their interest? But they're very passive in this relationship. They haven't made a move to get away.
Intel has made a little bit of a move by coming out with the Optane DIMM, and I don't know, you know, how would you folks look at that from the standpoint of power and from any of this other stuff? Is that a plus or a minus or what?
No, I think Optane's very well suited to CXL, or very well suited to be behind OMI on a CXL backside, as Alan sketched in his presentation this morning. I think that's a very good way to go. But it's a poor use of the DDR, the local bus interface, because it simply can't keep up. And also because that interface is a DRAM state machine, it had to be hacked in order to get something that wasn't DRAM to live on it. And that actually subtracts a lot of bandwidth. But that bandwidth is what's running the system. That's what those local channels are for. So I think putting it behind a controller, which eventually connects on the local memory, that's great. But stealing the local memory bandwidth for something that really can't keep up was a bad idea.
Yeah, and I don't think it's well suited to be, let's call it tier 0 or tier 1 memory, in my opinion, right? I think it's, like you said, I think it's well suited if you want to put it behind a CXL.mem. You know, I think it's got its purpose. You know, and to be honest, I don't think it's caught on as well as they had hoped, right? That's at least my perception. I don't think it's really taken the industry by storm per se. But like I said, I think it's got its place, it's got its merits. But as the foundational tier 0 memory, I don't think it's well suited there. That's at least my opinion on it.
It's kind of funny to look at what you guys are saying and compare it to Tom, who's been kind of quiet during all of this.
Yeah.
But you know, Tom's been looking at MRAM for, I don't know, decades. And
so is everybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah, except, well, you know, it'll be interesting to see what you have to say about it, Brian. But I know that Tom, you know, sees it as being a wonderful thing for endpoints in the Internet of Things because of its being low power. You want to say something about that, Tom?
Well, it's low power and it's smaller footprint too. I mean, especially there's a lot of static random access memory they use, and that has like 6 transistors. And you only have 1 transistor on the MRAM cell, so you get a lot more. You know, if you've got a especially on IoT applications, you're constrained on your die space, and so I can get a lot more of that MRAM memory than I could the SRAM. Plus, it does
persistence.
Yeah, it's persistent, and I can go into more low power states, which especially if you're running on a battery or energy harvesting application is very important. And there's probably some things even in the enterprise and data center space where that can also play a role.
Yeah, I mean, it's good for IoT and edge. And like you said, though, even in enterprise, right, there are certain parts of let's call it the storage part of the business within enterprise that needs persistence, right?
Oh,
because,
yeah.
I mean, you can't lose your data,
right?
I mean, so that has its merits, right? It hasn't, you know, and we've talked to a number of guys that have MRAM. Again, it's got its purposes. Like not a tier 0 again, but it's at least for the data center, right? Yeah. But I think it's got a lot of merit for a lot of different types of, like I said, in the edge, IoT, things like that. I think it's got a lot of play there. So,
and but also, Brian, you probably look at it as an embedded memory in some of your ASICs, don't you?
We do. We do. It's actually an offering.
And you can't say anything about that.
No, that's okay. I think even GF, actually has MRAM built into their libraries, if I remember right.
Well, and also, you know, and IBM also has their flash core systems, and they use MRAM as a cache on their SSDs.
Yes, exactly.
But Tom, it's more than just Global Foundries, isn't it, that has MRAM?
Oh, absolutely. Global Foundries is one. They've talked about it quite a bit, but TSMC actually has some products out in the field now. You know, initial products out that people have introduced, especially for wearable applications right now, where they're trying to implement trained artificial intelligence programs to be implemented, you know, as inference engines. So that's what they need that extra memory to hold that data. And there's a number of products that are starting to show up out there in the market. And I think it's going to be more. And not only TSMC and Global Foundries, but Samsung, UMC, and other major foundries have all talked about using MRAM, and also resistive RAM is another option that's out there.
Yeah, but not so much for main memory.
No, not so much for main memory. No.
Yeah.
Jim, can I jump in on the questions we've got queued up here?
Oh, certainly. I was trying to run through them with my little sheet of paper here.
Yeah, we talked about, I mean, somebody asked about Optane in production. I think there have been a few announcements like that. There are some products that are available, but I don't think it's ever made it in huge volume. I know that SAP has tried to work on it and tried optimizing HANA for it. It certainly is available if you hunt for it. I don't think it's in high volume use by anyone. And I gave some of the reasons before. It basically has some performance drawbacks if you configure a lot of it on servers.
Now, there are some storage applications with Optane. I've noticed that people are using it for metadata storage, etc., things like that. as
Yeah.
part of SSD-based systems. So I know there
Very
is.
targeted. I would
Yeah.
put it as you can sell petabytes of it at the moment for niche markets, but you can't sell exabytes like DRAM, not yet.
Not
I
yet.
think that will change with CXL.mem if everything's done well. It's probably a more appropriate place to find it. And you may find appliances with quite a lot of it loaded up inside because of its persistence benefits, its compactness, and its suitability in that form. Not competing with main memory, not taking away from main memory, but augmenting it. I think that's ideal.
Hey, by the way, Jim, I noticed that there's starting to be some questions in chat.
Yeah, I'm going to have to make sure to leave some time. I did
Yeah.
want to just get into the disaggregation
Yeah, probably
questions
should.
a little bit. And, you know, there was some discussion between Tanj and Brian about the putting things behind CXL. And, you know, this might be a good time to just talk a little bit about what's appropriate for near memory and what's appropriate for far memory and, you know, what people mean by that. What, for example, what are appropriate interfaces for near memory?
You know, there was a presentation this morning in the conference by SAP on which showed their experiments on using disaggregated memory on a Power 9. And it made it clear now, to some background, I know from talking to those folks, that they're very sophisticated in how they organize their memory. Nevertheless, there were cases in running their benchmarks where the disaggregated memory was up to 4 times slower. So it's definitely tricky to use memory that, and
at least efficiently.
Right, and they identified the cause as a latency. They had fairly extreme latency, around 900 nanoseconds for getting memory off another processor. CXL is probably going to be in the range of 200 nanoseconds, so that will come down. But what they did highlight is that they can only get so far with caching. After that, eventually programs run into pointer chasing and other patterns that simply cannot avoid the latency penalty. And so,
or can't incur it. They can't afford to incur it.
Right. So what I think really distinguishes near memory from disaggregated memory is going to be 2 things. One is the latency and the other is bandwidth. And bandwidth is actually there because if it's not good enough, it causes latency. You get queuing, and the queuing can actually be more severe latency than the static latency of the
you'll get these long tails.
Long tail, yeah.
So if you've got plenty of local memory, then it becomes easier to have your working set, your temporaries, all of that sort of stuff in your local memory near to the CPU. And then having disaggregated memory, perhaps shared by multiple CPUs, as an appliance in a rack, for example, becomes very attractive, opens up new possibilities. And to some extent, the balance of the two allows you to place data in the right place and to hide the latency cost of the disaggregated data, because probably you're going to fetch it in bulk and probably you're going to be able to hide some of the pointer traffic locally. I don't think either of them replaces the other. Local memories are always going to be more expensive, and disaggregated memory opens up the possibility of cheaper technologies, bulk technologies, but it's going to have a latency impact.
Right.
But it's not only disaggregated, but it's also a heck of a fast place to exchange messages between processors.
It can be.
Yeah.
But I think the trick is, like Tanj kind of touched on this a bit, is being able to manage, right, where the application space is sitting, right, is key, right? Because, you know, obviously if you can prefetch your data and you know, let's say that's on some sort of slower tier, right, and being able to munge on it and then move it back, right? That's kind of one paradigm. If you're going back and forth, right, and you have a need for really latency sensitive applications, you're going to kill yourself moving your data around. So you can't be doing that, right? You have to have efficient management of where your data is sitting and make sure it's staying where it needs to go. And if it does need to move, you're doing it very efficiently. So, I don't think one replaces the other. It's always, to me, it's a layered approach, right? Yeah. You're going to have your tier 0, DDR, you know, like direct connect or OMI. That's kind of a tier to me, right? Because it's got latency characteristics of load to use of, let's say, less than 100 for just a round number, right? Then you're going to get another class, right? That's going to be 100 to a couple of hundred. Then you're going to get the stuff and that's kind of like near far, right? And then you're going to get like far, right? But then you're going to get the stuff that's far. That's in, let's call it, a microsecond or more, right?
I'm
you
hearing
have
new
to
jargon
manage
here.
that.
Yes,
Far.
near far, yes.
Yeah, and also
Right,
manage on the
and
data.
it's not a new concept, to be honest, right? Because people have been doing it in ACPI tables forever, right? They understand, right? This tiering approach is not necessarily new, because even on a 8-socket or a 16-socket direct connect large SMP, there's near memory, the memory that's sitting off of your local processor. Then there might be one that's 1 hop away, and then there's others that's like 2 hops away, right? And you actually have to manage those different latency characteristics even on a direct SMP.
So it's kind of interesting, that we got the far memory, and CXL being example of that switch networking to the far memory. Part of the idea that I could pool my memory and then I can allocate it to virtual machines, right? Is there something special about OMI, especially I'm thinking for the near memory, that actually would help people in implementing the allocation of resources and creating that composable, what they call composable infrastructure based on that? I was curious.
Well, the OMI does raise the possibility of a controller that hides that from the program and uses, say, LPDDR as a cache for a more distant memory, or even SRAM as a possibility. If you had SRAM or magnetic memory, if that's more competitive than SRAM, there are ways you could build those controllers. They talk OMI to the host. All the host is doing with OMI is load and store. That's its primitives. It doesn't have, it doesn't have to worry about, are you pre-charging? Are you activating? What your bank structure? Any of that. So it then becomes much more open for the OMI controller to be imagined by the open community, and somebody can come up with a controller which talks to a storage class memory appliance, that talks to LPDDR, that maybe has some SRAM on it. Whatever they can imagine, they can do, because the SOC is no longer constraining imagination. With DDR, the SOC is saying, you've got to be a DRAM. That's all I'll talk to. I won't talk to anything else.
Because it's the memory buffer that has all the controllers on it. The processor doesn't really know that it's there. It's a load and a store, right?
So what OMI is doing here is opening up for imagination, opening up for innovation.
Right. Okay. Right. And then, it gives, like you said, it gives the industry the freedom for whatever controller that they want to try and develop, right? It could be DDR, it could be LPDDR, it could be any number of different things. For the processor itself, it's abstracted.
Now, of course, CXL opens up for imagination.
Same thing.
Yes, exactly. But the two together, I'm just wondering if there's some unique.
Yeah, there are physical consequences to CXL. CXL's optimized for the I/O scenario with meter-long paths, with more complexity in what can be done, with more intelligence required of the appliance. Those things are hard to shrink down into a cheap controller, and those things are hard to get down to a low latency. You've got about a 10 nanosecond latency overhead for the OMI controller.
You're answering one of the questions.
Probably 50 to 100 nanoseconds for the CXL path.
Yeah, because it's PCI based, right? To be honest.
And rather than expecting one to evolve to be everything, I think there's a case to be made that we can generate silicon. Both of these situations are well known. There's no problem with having both of them. Right.
I consider them to be complementary, to be honest, right? I think each one of them are well suited for different things, right? And in my mind, I mean, it gives folks the ability to have a complementary system, right? You could have OMI and CXL on it. And, Alan did some talks this morning or in his keynote that kind of showed some different thoughts. But it gives folks the flexibility to build something that's like that, because each one has the characteristics of what they're really good at. So
Okay, so I'm going to move to audience questions because we're in the last 10 minutes of this, and I think that there are enough questions that I should probably be doing that a little bit earlier than I had planned. So one of the easiest ones is from Alec Wallman. He says, what is the latency penalty of OMI versus CXL?
Well, as I said a moment ago, it's around 10 nanoseconds static. But one of the interesting things is latency is not just static latency, it's also dynamic. If you start loading up your processor, you can double the latency due to the queuing. Since RMI has a very good throughput, it can move to a higher level of traffic with less queuing. So in practice, it's not clear that 10 nanoseconds really means anything for a machine that's working. The practical latency over an RMI channel might actually be less than the practical latency over DDR, simply because it tolerates the queuing better.
I think the other thing you need to look at too, if you ever get a chance, if you're a member of CXL, and the OMI stuff you can just download for free off of the OMI website or the OpenCappy website, is the other thing that you also need to look at is just how the packets are created, right? How they're organized, how they're, the flip-based and all that stuff. One thing about OMI is it's really targeted. It's not the Swiss Army knife of everything as far as the templates that it has. If you look at the organization of how the frames are actually created for OMI, they're specifically created for memory, right? If you look at the ability to pack your frame, your flits together, right? It's well suited for a memory type paradigm. And that's something to just kind of consider, is how all that stuff is all kind of organized.
Okay, we've got another one from Stefan Sariu. Well, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but still, he's asking about the level of ECC reliability that LPDDR has versus DDR. Has anybody looked into that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a weakness, and another reason you can't simply scale LPDDR to server size. Mm-hmm. It has about 10 times reduction. It's hard to say exactly because the DRAM vendors are extremely secretive about the exact numbers here, which is kind of shocking. There's no other industry as large as that which doesn't disclose safety data. But anyway, that's what it is. So we can estimate that the built-in ECC on LPDDR5 and LPDDR4X probably reduces the error rate by about 10 times, but that's still not in the same range as the more sophisticated symbol-oriented ECC, which is found on servers. To build an LPDDR-based memory for servers around OMI, say, would require redundant, like 5 LPDDR5 chips, of which only 4 hold data and the other is used for ECC. So there would be some cost implications, but 25% overhead is actually the same overhead that you have in DDR5, so it's not unheard of.
Okay, so it sounds like then from a distant perspective, it looks like it's a wash.
If you engineered your controller correctly, yes, you could. I believe you could approach the same. But DDR5, as it's found today in mobiles and in laptops, is not at the same level of reliability that's expected from mainframe, from
enterprise,
server,
right? Exactly.
Server systems.
Yeah, you would never put an LPDDR5 in an enterprise type system, at least today.
Now, the OMI system does include CRC and retry mechanisms. So once the controllers ascertain that the data is correct, it is safely transported to the server.
And do I understand correctly?
IBM is extremely meticulous about these issues, and the fact that they've certified it gives you an idea of how good it can be.
Yeah, their reputation's riding on it. But am I right in assuming that you can also stick things into the OMI controller that haven't yet been specified out? That
well, OMI is a subset of OpenCappy, and the command packets retain the capability, but they're not defined to be used. And OpenCappy was originally a form of hardware-assisted remote procedure call. So it's very capable and very flexible. But the full open Cappy would require a more complicated controller. Anybody adding commands to OMI would be, you know, they'd have to kind of get a consensus as to what needs to be added. At the moment, OMI, one of its benefits is it's simplified. It's just basically what you need for memory, as Brian said.
Yeah, but
but you do have the freedom. Like, but your question though, Jim, is I mean, you do have the freedom, right? And it really depends on what you're doing, right? Obviously, you know, you have the architecture itself is pretty open-ended from that perspective. So you do have freedom, right? It gives you a lot of discretion on if you want to add enhancements to it. Some of it you don't necessarily have to bring back into the consortium. Some of it you could just kind of keep private if you wanted to. But if there's things that you wanted to do to, I don't know, that's already specified in the specification itself, you would just have to basically bring it into the consortium and get it approved, right? So if you wanted to make, I don't know, some sort of addendum onto maybe a template format or something else, right? Depending on what you're attaching to, you may choose to just keep it private, or you may choose to bring it back to try and have the industry try and adopt it and make everything better.
yeah,
You know,
It's not a closed environment.
You can do what Samsung's done on their processing and memory HBM. I think it's called Aqua XL or something like that.
yeah, it's got some name like that.
Something based on water and XL.
Aquabolt, Aquabolt.
Aquavolt XL,
Yes.
Right. And I advise people to take a note of it and look it up. It's very interesting. But that's got a memory mapped command set, so that there's nothing actually changing about the memory protocol. It's just that the controller has its own area that you write into, and it understands that what's being written there is not actually memory, it's a command. And when you can read completions from that area as well. And that would be something you could do clearly with OMI. The fact that OMI has variable timing on the transactions makes that much easier, in fact, than it is with HBM.
Yeah, I was thinking something a little bit different, just as you can, you know, CXL will allow you to put 3D cross-point memory behind it, or Optane, you know, whatever you choose to call it, or MRAM or DRAM or whatever. I believe that OMI also has a possibility to do that. It's just not built in yet. It's right now, it's the only controllers that are available for OMI support DRAM. Is that true?
That's true.
Yeah. So there's a
Both
possibility.
aspects, the flexibility and the fact that at the moment it's just DRAM.
Yeah. We've got a little bit of time left. I want to get one question on here. This is, let me just see who wrote this question, but it's somebody who works for Libra SoC, it said, and Luke Layton, I guess it is, said that here's a thought exercise. We're developing a 4 to 8 core SoC with maximum power consumption of 3.5 watts for the entire system, and 2 packages with 400 and 650 pins. And what would you recommend for the memory subsystem for that? He says it's like a Samsung smartphone processor.
Yeah.
LPDDR.
Okay, so simple answer, right?
I mean, there's no point in overselling OMI. OMI is very good for large memory systems. That's where we're going to see it shine. Mobile systems, LPDDR is a nice solution.
Yep, I would agree.
Oh, well, heck, that was too easy.
That's a fast one.
Well, look at his footprint, 3.5 watts. I mean,
Yeah.
3.5 watts is pretty darn
Low power is the definition, yes.
Yeah. So, you know, what are some of the other benefits to abstracting memory? I mean, or as you were saying, Brian, abstracting the processor. I love your way of inverting that whole thing.
That is
Competition, free enterprise, getting the industry accelerating along a new dimension that's been kind of idle for a while.
No, I would agree. I think innovation is really the key, right? Because I mean, there's no one company that really dominates everything anymore, right? So I mean, it's the freedom of choice, it's the freedom of innovation, right? And you're seeing that a lot now, but it needs to continue to grow. But like I like what Tanj said about, you know, the processor folks have been really slow to really get out of their comfort zone with DDR. It sure would be nice if they would really maybe put their toe in the water a little bit, because I think there are so many other possibilities if they could get off of that. Right. So, but we'll have to, only time will tell.
That's
Well,
impressive.
Brian, I'm noticing the, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh no, I was just going to say that's one of the things I was impressed with OMI is that you can have the combination of very high performance and a lot of memory, and none of the other configure, and controlling your costs. None of the other alternatives really allow you to do that. So it really opens, I think, the door up to a lot more imagination on how you can design things. Sorry, go ahead.
And it's changing a lot. I mean, even if you look at what CXL is doing, right? It started off very simple, but now it's grown a lot, right? And it's getting complex. And I think, OMI and OpenCappy, for better or worse, has basically kicked the industry, right? And it's kind of woken it up. And, I think what you're going to see is it's going to continue to spur innovation, right? And I have to believe that even CXL today, even though today, I don't think it's well suited for tier 0. I have to imagine the folks that are basically behind the scenes of that are looking at it.
Well, that's a good note to end on. And I noticed from Brian's clock that it's 10 minutes to 8, which is the perfect time to end this thing. So anyway, I'd like to thank everybody. Tom Coughlin, who I see right now, Tanj Bennett, Brian Allison. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, Jim, for
Thanks for hosting. Yep. Take care, guys.
Bye.